Good afternoon. For a lot of you, it's good morning. For some of you, it is already good evening. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I am thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live show, where each week I answer a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators like hyperscale, co-location, edge, and modular providers, technology and facilities companies that work with data center operators and enterprises, as well as construction and real estate related companies and capital related companies that work with the data center and digital infrastructure ecosystem. And let's not forget the outsourced sales and marketing companies as well that are a really important part of the digital infrastructure ecosystem. And it doesn't matter what role you're in within the go-to-market team. Maybe you're in sales or marketing or account management or product or channel partnerships, or perhaps you're the leader, the executive sponsor that brings everyone together, gets everyone aligned, and making sure that you're all working towards the same common goals, all on the same pace, all on the same page, and collaborating like a master symphony orchestra conductor. So before we jump into this week's 6 big questions, if you don't already get our weekly newsletter, it's the best way to stay on top of new live educational events, live streams and webinars and educational resources, new podcasts just like this. Make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays at www.dcsmi.com. So what's on the agenda for this week? First, we're going to start out by looking at, when selling hyperscale solutions, how do you determine the most relevant information to share? Next, we'll look at how a data center solutions provider can attract more clients. After that, we'll turn our attention to how a data center services company can get its name brand known well outside their local area. Then we'll take a quick break for a message from our sponsor. After that, we'll get into how to enter the data center construction market as a building materials manufacturer. After that, we'll explore how a critical infrastructure systems integrator can improve power and cooling lead generation. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live show, we'll explore how to grow an industrial power distribution company for data center critical facilities companies. Make sure to let your colleagues, coworkers, the entire ecosystem know about this week's live show by hitting the like button. Also, if you have an idea for a future challenge, a future question that you're grappling with that you'd like us to consider answering on an upcoming show, make sure to leave that right in the comments. So first up, what do we got? When selling hyperscale solutions, how do you determine the most relevant information to share? That's a fantastic question. And it really depends what the nature is of what you sell as far as hyperscale solutions. Typically, when most people talk about selling hyperscale solutions, it's usually because they work for a data center operator. But there's companies that sell technology and facilities type of products and services, even construction and real estate that are directly related to hyperscale, that also have their own issues around determining the most relevant information to share. But the most common use case where someone's working on go-to-market sales and marketing strategy for selling hyperscale solutions is a data center operator. Sometimes all they do is sell hyperscale. Sometimes they sell both hyperscale and more retailish kind of co-location and a bunch of other managed services related to that. But we're going to focus primarily on a data center operator here in this particular case that sells pure hyperscale solutions. So how do you determine the most relevant information to share? There's a couple things that are going on with that. One is the better job you can do with narrowing down who the hyperscale buyers is, which, if we're being practical about it, could be as few as a couple dozen companies. Maybe if you're really stretched the definition, it's a couple hundred companies. But the more crisp you are about where you've been most successful in the past, what kinds of hyperscalers are dominating your case studies page, that are providing the most economic and strategic value to your company, that get the most value from working with your company. The more precise you can be on that definition of who that hyperscaler is, the easier everything becomes. So at the minimum, we want to know geographically where these companies are located, because of course, depending on where you're located, where your facilities are located, governance and regulation and compliance and certification issues can come up that are unique to that geographic region. Second, we want to know, are you best suited to sell hyperscale solutions to enterprise clients that need hyperscale, or are you better off selling to mid-market clients, that mid-market companies that need hyperscale? You don't have to be a Fortune 1000 company to have hyperscale related needs. So get really crisp on not so much the power that they need or the square footage that they need, but if you were hitting a company prospecting database like LinkedIn Sales Navigator or ZoomInfo or something like that, what is the range of revenue or the range of employees from smallest to largest that are a good fit for what you sell that's related to hyperscale? In other words, what company is so small that it's unlikely that it's going to be profitable for you to work with them and they won't be able to afford your minimums? And is there an upper end of range where the company could be so huge that they're just kind of, if you're being self-aware, I don't want to say out of your league, but the sales process may be too complicated. The financial regulatory requirements may be too complicated, and there's more of a sweet spot like Goldilocks, not too big, not too small, where you've done best in the past. I don't know. That's up to you to figure that out. That's your job in getting to product market fit and getting to go to market fit. Your case studies, your logo should help tell that story. But yeah, be self-aware of where they're located, what their company size is, and the nature of their business model. In other words, are there highly regulated industries that need this hyperscale where you've done especially well, or where you just haven't been able to fill these gaps? So what comes top to mind are things like financial services, healthcare, government, education, any areas that are where the intersection of highly regulated needs and hyperscale could become an issue, where either you have a strength or a potential weakness or a gap in your product roadmap. So once we have your ICP, once we have your ideal client profile well defined, from there you can build out a target account list of the companies, the hyperscalers that you want to be able to get your most relevant information to share in front of. And then we need to figure out within those companies, who are the stakeholders that matter most to their buyer's journey and your sales cycle. And again, this is largely going to be looking at your historical, among your logos, among your case studies and your CRM, the kinds of stakeholders that have been involved in these conversations, the kind of decision makers that have been involved in these conversations at various stages of the life cycle. So once you have clarity on that, you can designate the most important stakeholder as your primary buyer persona, the second most important category of stakeholder that's involved in researching and comparing and evaluating your hyperscale solutions. The second most important category of stakeholder would be a secondary buyer persona. Maybe there's a third category as well, a tertiary buyer persona, and there may even be a negative buyer persona, the kind of stakeholder that if they show up, like the skull and crossbones warning signs come up that, hey, this person is not on your side. So once we have that in mind and we've prioritized who the most important kind of person is within those accounts that we need to educate and build trust with, then we're in a good position to look at the consensus on what that person cares most about, becoming extremely empathetic, extremely customer-centric, extremely client-centric. So we get clarity when we look at a cross-section of 5, 10, 20 people in each of those segments. What are their biggest goals that they need to accomplish that are relevant to your hyperscale solutions, both individually, as a team, as a department, as an organization? What are they working on that they need to get right? And not only just guessing about that, but figuring out what the consensus is with looking at a decent sample size within that particular buyer persona segment. And we don't want to just guess what these goals are or guess what their words are. We need their exact words. So sure, there's probably someone in your company that will give you a lot of solicited and unsolicited advice about what's going on inside the minds of your hyperscale buyers. And sure, take that as input. consider that maybe 20, 25% of the input. But the other 75 to 80% of the input for your buyer personas should come from actual research. The best research, face-to-face conversations, video sessions like Zoom meetings. The second best is identifying 5, 10, 20 people in that segment and look at how they describe themselves on their LinkedIn profile, what kind of content they interact with, where they hang out online and offline, the skills they're endorsed for, the groups they belong to, the job descriptions, the stressors. What do you notice about what they're interacting with, who they're interacting with the most? And then take that same person's name and do a Google search and see what pops up and see if they've been quoted in trade journal articles, news releases, they've done guest blogging, spoken at events, guested on podcasts, guested on webinars. All of that take into account to get the consensus on that buyer persona's biggest goals and challenges in their own word. And when I say challenges, these are the things that are driving them nuts. These are the things that if they don't get right, really screw with their work-life balance, could cause even mental health problems, causes their family to resent their job when they're on vacation and the vacation gets compromised. A whole host of issues that they are crying out for the need for help. So this is where your information can really, really save the day by introducing them to best practices and new insights about how other stakeholders, just like this particular group of stakeholders, have navigated this kind of challenge in a similar size kind of company and a similar geographic region. So take that into account, their biggest goals and challenges, use that to build a content calendar, an editorial calendar, a topic calendar for educational events, and then do the same exact exercise for the secondary buyer persona, the second most important kind of stakeholder that shows up on the decision committee. And perhaps there's even a third kind of stakeholder. A lot of times with data center operators, a secondary or a tertiary buyer persona may be a channel partner, like an integrator or a consultant or a managed service provider, an MSP or a master agent or something like that, indirect. So with that in mind, once we have the consensus, that's how you decide what's the most relevant information to share. Is that we need to have extreme empathy about what our most important, our primary and our secondary buyer persona are trying to achieve in their job, both on an individual level, as a team, as a department, and as a company. And we also need to know the biggest challenges related to hyperscale, related to digital infrastructure that are driving them nuts. And once we have that, it's much easier to come up with a content and event strategy that grabs them by the virtual shirt collar when they're scrolling through their LinkedIn feed or their YouTube feed or looking at search results or something like that, and pulls them in to want to learn more. What we also need to be super aware of is today's hyperscale buyer is researching and comparing and making their decisions very differently than a hyperscale buyer did 10 years ago. And it's not just a matter that there's power density issues and AI and high performance compute. Sure, that stuff all matters. However, the one change that a lot of data center operators are completely overlooking is the self-driven buyer's journey. What does that mean? 10 years ago, hyperscale buyers would be willing to spend time with someone or someones from your sales team when they're about halfway through their research and decision-making process. About 10 years ago, the number that was widely cited was 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before sales contact and vendor contact. That was research originally done by CEB, the corporate executive board, that's now owned by Gartner. At the time, they had done this research with Sirius Decisions and Salesforce. Fast forward 10 years ahead with digital transformation, a lot of baby boomers retiring, a lot more Gen Z and millennials getting elevated into decision-making roles, millions of people working from home for the first few years of the 2020s. And we're now in a place where that 56 number has jumped all the way over to 83%. What does that mean? 83% of a typical buyer's journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing, now happens before you get to meet a prospect. The game is 83% over before you're even allowed into the stadium to compete, to win that business. And that's brutal for a lot of traditional marketing and sales teams that haven't adjusted their playbook much in recent years. But it also opens up a tremendous opportunity for those sales, marketing, go-to-market teams that are paying attention to what's actually going on and are flexible enough and realistic enough to adjust their strategy. What's the strategy change that needs to happen? Well, your prospects and clients need to see your client-facing team no longer by their traditional job roles, no longer focused on just a transaction or booking a meeting. Instead, your prospects and clients, instead of being chased and you begging them for attention, your prospects and clients need to want to spend time with members of your client-facing team. In other words, your account executives, your sales development reps, your marketers, your account managers, your product managers, channel account managers, they all need to be seen as teachers, as consultants, as subject matter experts, as trusted advisors. And some of them may elevate all the way up to being seen as thought leaders. And this is not going to happen overnight. It's a major culture change for a lot of companies. But if you don't do this, there will be other individuals and other companies in there throughout the early and middle stages of the buyer's journey that are educating and building trust with the prospects and clients that you want so badly. However, the ones that are in there early and often are the ones that are going to frame the criteria by which they evaluate everyone else. So when you're able to get in there early and often, so you can be in on as many of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision throughout awareness to consideration and consideration to decision. When you get in early, you get to frame the criteria by which they judge everyone else. By staying with those prospects and clients throughout their full buyer's journey and continuing to educate and build trust about what's top of mind for them, you're nearly guaranteed to earn and stay on the shortlist. In some cases, what will end up happening is the more time they spend with you, the less interest and time that they'll have in spending with anyone else. So you'll start to knock other companies, other competitors off of the shortlist. And what you may discover in many cases, when you do this exceptionally well, by the end of the buyer's journey, when they hit that 83% point, when they're at the decision stage and ready to talk about a sales context, you may discover that you are the last team standing. This is incredibly impactful, but it doesn't happen overnight. And for a lot of clients, there are a lot of companies, there are a lot of limiting beliefs and cultural forces and things that are just plain sabotaging these teams. In a lot of cases, the paid media versus earned media versus owned media, the ratios are completely whacked out of existence for how your buyers want to engage with a company like yours. So at the end of the day, if you're serious about selling hyperscale solutions and determining the most relevant information to share, consider how crisp you are about your definition of your ideal clients, your ideal client profile, how locked in you are on your target account list, how deep and relevant and recent your customer insight research is on your primary and secondary and perhaps your tertiary buyer personas, and how good of a job is your team showing up in such a way that your client-facing team are no longer seen by their traditional job titles, but instead are seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with hyperscale solutions in your geographic regions for companies at this size in these kinds of business models for these particular stakeholders. The better job you do with that, the more you will freeze out other noise that is trying to vie for their attention. And the better job you do with educating and building trust, the more it is a game-changing impact on how your company grows its pipeline, grows its client list, grows its revenue, and ultimately retains and lands and expands with those kinds of hyperscale clients that you want the most. Next question up. How does a data center solutions provider attract more clients? How does a data center solutions provider attract more clients? That's a great question. So we first need to know what kind of clients you actually want to attract. And the way we're going to get more specific about who those clients are is we're going to look at where you've done the best in the past. Typically, that would show up in case studies. It would show up in the logos on your website. It would for sure show up in your CRM under deals that are closed won, WON, and where anecdotally you're seeing the best success. Where from a unit economic standpoint, talk to your CFO. What kinds of clients does your CFO love to see you bring on all day long? Once you get clarity on that, it's a lot easier to define geographically where these folks are located, how big or small their companies are, with specific guardrails around like employee headcounts, and perhaps business models or industries where these companies are located in. So once we're super specific about that, from there you can build your target account list. From there you can decide what your approach is going to be to designing, creating, publishing, and promoting, distributing educational resources, educational events that are most important for those kinds of clients that you're trying to attract. And you're really not trying to attract the company. You're trying to attract the most important individuals within those companies that have the most significant role in deciding how their company researches and compares and evaluates different kinds of data center solution providers. So once you know where they're located, their company size, their industry, then the part of the hard work is figuring out who is most likely to be on those decision committees to have the most productive working relationship throughout the full journey, from lead to opportunity, opportunity to client, client to promoter, long-term promoter that helps to fuel more positive word of mouth and lands and expands over time. Cross-selling, upselling, customer marketing, great account management, all that good stuff. So to attract more clients, we first need to get really specific about who they are at a company level, who the individuals are that are involved, and then those individuals, what do they care most about? When your primary buyer persona, when your secondary buyer persona are going out and trying to figure out how to solve their data center related solutions, what are their biggest goals individually, at a team level, at a company level? And what are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest stressors? What's driving them nuts? Remember, like a digital infrastructure engineer may care about significantly different issues than a cybersecurity information leader. And that person may care about significantly different issues than a compliance person or a finance person. So you need to figure out, by the nature of your business model, who is usually in on these conversations, who weighs in, who has the most clout with deciding what the criteria is historically based on what you've done as a company, and then tailor your whole educational events, resources, strategy around educating and building trust with these folks in a hyper relevant way to what they care about. Not what you care about or want them to care about when they're ready for sales contact, but what they actually care about in the early and the middle stages of the buyer's journey. And that's a big cautionary note as well. It's really important to understand that the self-guided, the self-driven buyer's journey is now the predominant buyer journey when it comes to anything and everything related to digital infrastructure. What this means is your best prospects and clients are now spending most of their buyer's journey, most of your sales cycle without you. They're doing a ton of research online, on search engines, on posing questions on social media, listening to podcasts, attending webinars, watching YouTube videos, going to review websites. They are consuming an absurd amount of information. So by the time they meet with someone from your sales team, it's highly likely that this particular individual may actually know more about what you do than some of your entry-level hires. And that's a really dangerous place to be in. So it's exceptionally important that you lean into this idea that a huge part of what your client-facing team needs to do is to reposition themselves to be seen more as consultants, educators, trusted advisors, subject matter experts, and a few of them even as thought leaders. Because when you can unlock that, you'll start to get invited in way more often in that first 83% of the buyer's journey that's currently off limits to traditional sales teams. And it wasn't always this bad. 10 years ago, buyers of data center related solutions typically spent about a half of the buyer's journey, about a half of your sales cycle with a member from your sales team. You don't get in for half of the time anymore. You're only in there for like 17%, best case scenario, if you even are found. So that's a really, really small sliver of attention. And if you don't do this right with differentiation, you're sharing that 17%, perhaps with multiple other companies that are on their shortlist. So the answer at the end of the day is by becoming hyper aware of and hyper of their biggest goals and challenges and hyper empathetic to those challenges and showing up in a way that educates and builds trust with those folks throughout the entire buyer's journey, not just the last 17%. Because when you show up and you set up the booth at the conference, you're only in on the last 17%. You're not participating in that first 83%. That is as precarious as a professional sports team not being allowed into the stadium until 83% of the game is over. Imagine you're a general manager of a professional sports team, and for whatever reason, your team shows up and football match, basketball, whatever, they're not allowed into the stadium until the fourth quarter. Baseball game, they're not allowed into the stadium till like the eighth inning. It's going to be a blowout by then, right? You've already forfeited. So that's essentially what's happening if you haven't adjusted your sales, marketing, and go-to-market playbook much in the last few years. That you're essentially forfeiting, you're waving the white flag, you're conceding the first 83% of the buyer's journey. But it doesn't have to be that way. If you're serious about being seen as the definitive go-to expert on anything and everything having to do with being a data center solutions provider in specific geographic markets with specifically sized companies in specific industries, specific business models, and the stakeholders that are most relevant to those decisions, it can be a game changer. But if you're asleep at the wheel on this and you're fighting, kicking, and screaming, I can assure you there are other competitors, direct competitors, indirect competitors, even non-business model competitors that are dramatically shaping the criteria by which your prospects and clients research and ultimately make their purchase decisions. For a lot of companies, these are cultural changes that are significant enough that this kind of initiative, the internal champion, needs to start all the way at a CEO level. Now, if your company has thousands of employees, it will probably come down to a chief revenue officer, a chief commercial officer, or a chief marketing officer, or something like that. But if your company has a couple dozen or a couple hundred employees, this is big enough that getting your CEO to be willing to invest a half hour once or twice a month on this, to wave the flag, show the internal champion, show that they're behind this kind of initiative, is incredibly important, because for a lot of companies, these are pretty big culture changes. So this is what I would keep in mind if you are a data center solutions provider and you're trying to attract more of the right clients, generate more of the right leads, getting in front of, reaching the right decision makers. Next question up is, how does a data center services company get its name and brand known outside of their local area? How does a data center services company get its name and brand known outside of their local area? That's a great question. And depending on the nature of your business model, this can be either incredibly relevant or may not be as relevant. By the fact that this person asked this question, they more than likely see it as relevant. A good way to think of it is data center operators, let's say a co-location data center operator, typically need two different kinds of sales, marketing, and go-to-market playbooks at the absolute minimum. But at a high level, there's usually a playbook that's local or hyper-local that's targeting people that can drive to your facility within a 30 or 60-minute drive of your facility. They traditionally used to call this server huggers, but the beauty of marketing and selling and servicing individuals within companies that can drive within 30 to 60 minutes is there's an amazing amount of super cool, impactful things that you can do with educational events right in your own facility that cost very little to produce and can have an amazing impact. I actually struggle to understand why more co-location data center operators aren't completely over-indexing on that relative to other way more expensive bets that they're taking, where they have to share that attention with 100 other companies. When they come to your facility and they're spending 60, 90 minutes at your lunch and learn or your breakfast seminar or your symposia or your tour, whatever it is, they're 100% paying attention to you. It is an awesome, beautiful thing. So that's the hyper local playbook. And of course, there's local community events that are relevant to your ecosystem. There's national organizations that have local chapters in your area. There's a lot of things that you can do that are focused on local. The person that asked this question, though, is they want to know how they can get their name and their brand known outside of their local area. And that's a very relevant playbook, especially for a co-location operator, because in addition to people that choose their company, choose their facility by virtue of proximity, there are also companies on the other side of your country, perhaps on the other side of your planet, that specifically need to have local presence in your area. They either need it for latency reasons, they need it for governance reasons, whatever it is, they need a co-location facility close by. You could almost say that leans up against why people would look at an edge facility, right? So that's who we're talking about here. And with that in mind, I would encourage you to build a separate playbook for your digital buyer as opposed to your local buyer. Your digital buyer will also need to have its own ideal client profile and will also need to have its own one or two different buyer personas that you're targeting with your educational resources and your educational events. So we need to know when we're talking about getting your name and brand known outside of your local area, what is this area that's outside of your local area that where you think you can win most often? It's possible it's global, but it's also entirely possible that you can get way more specific about that. Maybe it's the whole European Union. Maybe it's Asia Pacific, the APAC. Maybe it's a handful of countries within APAC. Maybe it's 2 or 3 countries within Latin America. But I would encourage you, as you're building this motion, as you're building this playbook, as you're building this ideal client profile, to get specific about where you want to be known outside of your local area, because everywhere else global, it's really hard to boil the ocean, right? Because for starters, you will have to create content and marketing and support in many different languages besides the primary language in your facility. So that alone will likely narrow your list geographically of where you want to target. Then there's compliance issues that come up that are unique to those particular countries and specific industries where you need to be reasonably well versed to be successful with that. So between language and localization issues and compliance issues that are unique to industries and business models, get specific about where are the areas outside of your local area where you want to get your name and brand known. Second, what company sizes do you typically win most often and retain? And are your clients most happy, both initially and intended value and expanded value, extended value, when it comes to your account managers, when it comes to customer success? And more than likely, your local client size, where you've done best, will have a lot in common with the locals, with the size of clients where you'll do best outside of your local geographic region. And then there's the business model or industry component, which again, there will be certain kinds of business models that your company may be very well suited to work with outside your local area. And then there will be some that will be nearly impossible, depending on the intersection of geographic and industry and business models. So get really specific about that. That'll help you define an ideal client profile for outside of your local area. That should also help figure out what your segmentation and personalization strategy is going to be around how you segment into buyer personas. Who's the most important kind of stakeholder that you need to build these relationships with and educate and build trust outside of your local area? That would be your primary buyer persona. Who's the second most important kind of stakeholder that you want to educate and build trust with outside of your local area? There may even be a tertiary or even a negative buyer persona. But at the minimum, I would define and prioritize a primary and a secondary buyer persona for getting your name known and your brand known outside of your local area. Then once you've determined that, then you use the same kind of playbook, the same kind of methodology that you use to build your buyer personas for your local area. We need to look at a representative sample of 5, 10, 20 people in each of those segments. And we need to understand the consensus on their biggest goals and their biggest challenges in their own words. And then we repeat that same exercise for the secondary buyer personas. And then once we know in their own words what they're trying to get done in their job when it comes to your data center services and what they're struggling most in their job, then we can set about creating a content calendar, an educational events strategy kind of calendar that educates and builds trust with those folks in a hyper-specific way for what kind of company they're coming from and what kind of role they have within those companies. The difference is we can't lean on the fact that we can set up a exhibit booth in front of them in their local area. We need to do this digitally. We can't lean on the fact that they can hop in their car and drive over to your facility in 30, 60 minutes. Again, we need to do this digitally. So this is where once you have consensus on their biggest goals and challenges, your blogging strategy, your video strategy, your social media strategy, especially on LinkedIn and YouTube, what you're doing with lead generation, what you're doing with segmentation and nurturing to continue educating and building trust and accelerating the sales cycle. And most of all, what you're doing to stay with them throughout the 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision, and how you're going to do this long distance virtually. So by definition, you will almost certainly need to make some significant investments in video content, both content that they can watch on their own, like virtual tours, but even way before they're at the final 17% of the journey and they're ready for a virtual tour, what are you going to do to engage with them, to educate and build trust with them throughout their awareness and the consideration stages of the buyer's journey? And at the risk of getting a little bit meta, it could be something like a weekly live stream, a Q&A show. It could be an interview-based podcast. It could be webinars. It could be panel webinars, case study webinars. There's a bunch of different approaches that you can have with these virtual events and these virtual content, but recognize that your long distance content approach needs to be a proxy for what would have taken place face to face. So any question that your account executives, your sales development reps, your account managers typically get asked is a candidate to taking that exact same question and creating a knowledge-based article, a blog about it, a social post about it, and of course a video about it, and sharing it in all relevant channels where they would discover your company. So if you're starting to get the impression that content and educational events are incredibly important for getting your name and brand known outside your local area, you are for sure getting the right impression, because just like in your local area, the self-driven buyer's journey, where 83% of the research and decision-making is over before they're ready to talk to you, is an even bigger deal, because you can't compensate for shortcomings in that strategy with face-to-face conversations. Almost everything is going to happen in a self-service or one-to-many type of virtual event context. So that's what I would be thinking of for a data center services company that wants to get its name and brand known outside your local area. So we have 3 additional questions that we'll be covering in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. But if you've been getting great value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button and feel free to leave a comment on this show as well. Let us know if there is a challenge or a question that you'd like us to consider addressing in an upcoming episode of the show. And here's a quick message from our sponsor, and we'll be right back.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We are all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center, the digital infrastructure industry. And you are watching our weekly live Q&A show, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. Next question up is, how do we enter the data center construction market as a building materials manufacturer? Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And the first place to start is to get really specific about what kinds of companies you want to sell directly to versus indirect. Because when it comes to construction projects, there's general contractors and there's dozens of other categories of companies that are typically involved. So where, if you're brand new to this business, you don't have product market fit. So you haven't yet gotten to the point where you know exactly who the ideal clients are, what products and services, what kinds of building materials they purchase from you, how often they purchase from you, and what quantities at what price points, all the good stuff around unit economics and pattern recognition. So early on, one of the most important things that you can do is get really specific about who these construction companies are and what they care most about, what's top of mind for them. So when it comes to defining who these data center construction companies are, we want to fill out the basics of your ideal client profile. We need to know geographically, where are you primed to do business? Where can you realistically market and sell and deliver your building materials? Can you deliver globally? If you can, fantastic. If not, you probably want to get way more specific in your ideal client profile about the geographic part of who you're targeting, where these construction companies are located. Second, I would encourage you to get specific about the company sizes that are a great fit for you. In other words, is it cost effective for a really small construction company that like works on one project at a time to buy building materials from you? Or do they need, or is there a certain company size, a certain number of projects, a certain number of revenue, a certain head count that they need to have to meet your minimums? Conversely, at the extreme upper end of the range, is there a construction company size that's so large that the financial burdens, the length of the sales process, the political hurdles you'd have to jump through, all of that stuff becomes too much of a burden? And then you eventually come to the conclusion, usually, that there's a certain range of company size that's a particularly good fit for you that you want to target. Then there are also maybe things that come up that are unique to the kinds of projects that construction company engages in when it comes to the specific industries. Are they really good with healthcare? Are they really good with operators? Are they really good with enterprise financial services data centers? Again, that's going to come from just more iterations, more reps, more getting into these conversations, because that's what the goal with all of this is, to accelerate your path to product market fit. But if you want to be able to enter the construction market for a building materials manufacturer, get really specific about who the companies are. Second, use that information to build a target account list of the construction companies that you want to build relationships with, that you want to educate and build trust with. And this could be as simple as using a database like LinkedIn Sales Navigator or ZoomInfo, or using some listicles from trade publications, or just simple Google searches to manually compile a list of probably a couple dozen construction companies. It could be a couple hundred construction companies, depending on the nature of how expansive your territory is that you are selling to. But a lot of this is figuring out whether you need to be selling to specialty contractors or general contractors, and the nature of who they are, where you can win the best, what lines up the best with your unit economics. And then within those companies, who's the best kind of contact person that you want to be building a relationships with, that you want to earn your way into and educate and build trust about all the issues that are tangential or adjacent to the decisions that go into deciding where they're going to buy building materials from. So for a lot of companies that haven't touched their playbook much in years, this may be a relatively new concept. But the way we get dialed into who these people are and what they care most about is we do something called buyer persona research. What buyer persona research means is we, and especially with entering a new market, you don't know what you don't know, but you have a best guess as to who you think the most important kind of stakeholder is going to be in these decision-making processes. And then you probably have a best guess of who the second most important kind of stakeholder, the secondary buyer persona, is. And then we need to talk to, ideally, or at the minimum study, 5, 10, 15 people in each of those two segments, and try to get the consensus on what their biggest goals and challenges are when it comes to anything and everything having to do with building materials that go into major data center construction projects. So when we know the consensus on their biggest goals and their biggest challenges in their own words, it becomes much easier to align all of our playbook, our sales and marketing messaging, everything that we're doing around that approach. Like even your website, don't bother doing much with creating messaging for copywriting for your website until you've nailed exactly who they are, what they care about in their own words. And there will inevitably be a minimum of 2 different kinds of stakeholders that you'll be selling these building materials to. There's probably a construction executive. There's almost certainly a financial executive. There could be other people involved as well, depending on the nature of whether you're selling to specialty contractors or general contractors. Again, you'll figure that out over time, but we need to get really dialed into at a company level where they work and what they do in these companies and what's top of mind for them, because that's the way that we're going to be able to show up in a way that cuts through the clutter, that differentiates, that gets them to stop and pay attention to what, because we don't want to show up as a vendor. The days of being able to be successful with showing up and just trying to beg for a meeting and pitch your stuff is done. Most companies in the data center ecosystem that are using that outdated playbook are really struggling now, because what's ending up happening is your buyers are spending so much time doing this self-directed research before they get to you, that when you're elbowed out of these early and middle stage conversations and you only get to meet prospects at the absolute end, your competition has essentially done all the education and trust building in a way that your prospects and clients that you want the most badly are now heavily swayed towards the purchase criteria, the comparison guide, that other companies have laid out. So it's incredibly important to figure out a way for your experts within your company to get in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so you can get out of the vendor box. So they see you as way more than just an expert on building materials, but they see you as an expert on anything and everything that has to do with the process of building and data center construction projects at the intersection of what they care most about and your particular expertise. Now, what you might find is initially there may be only a few people in your company that you feel comfortable putting out there as teachers and consultants and subject matter experts when it comes to this particular topic. Over time, what's incredibly important is institutionalizing this knowledge into playbooks that all of your account executives, that all of your account managers, that all of your project managers, all of your sales development, business development reps feel comfortable executing at various different levels of expertise. Because the only way in which you're going to earn your way in now early and often in the self-driven buyer's journey is to show up as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with building materials for these kinds of data center construction projects in this particular geographic region, at a certain company size or a certain company scale level, and certain kinds of context, business models, industries, and verticals. And for many companies, these are massive culture changes that the more deeply entrenched your team members are that have been working in the industry, sometimes it can be awfully difficult to get people to change how they position, how they present themselves. If only it was as simple as going into email signatures and LinkedIn profiles and business cards and doing a find and replace on the job title. You certainly can do that, but there's a lot more to it than that, because it changes the nature of how you approach your target market. It changes the nature of the interactions that you have with those kinds of prospects and clients. It changes the expectations. It's playing a longer game, but it can be a much more lucrative, a much more profitable game. And frankly, if you don't adopt this going forward, over time, you're going to get squeezed more and more and more into a place where you're not involved in the final 17%. You may be involved in the final 1% or not involved at all. So the key to entering the data center construction market as a building materials manufacturer is recognizing that the self-driven buyer's journey is now the predominant buyer's journey. Your target audience, your data center construction companies, no longer really want to spend a ton of time with data center building material vendors anymore, but they're very open to people that can show up and help them navigate the unique challenges that they're having for someone in that particular job role in a certain kind of construction company, in a certain kind of geographic region of a certain size. And you'll know that they're facing these challenges because you've done your homework, you've done your customer insight research, and you're showing up in a way that earned your way in so that you're invited in as an expert. So instead of your account executives, your sales development, business development folks having to constantly nag and beg and manipulate and cajole to try to get to these meetings, it's the other way around. They've discovered who you are, what you stand for, your unique insights, and you're instead getting invited in early and often in the right context so that they see your client-facing team members as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to building materials for data center construction projects. Next question up is, how does a critical infrastructure systems integrator improve power and cooling lead generation? How does a company that provides critical infrastructure system integration improve its power and cooling lead generation? So we need to get really specific about where you've been most successful with your power and cooling clients in the past. And that's usually going to come from looking at case studies, looking at testimonials, looking at your logos, looking at your CRM, your customer relationship management history, talking to your account managers, and understanding what kinds of power and cooling clients have had the most success with your company and why. Once we understand that, that will allow you to outline an ideal client profile that will be incredibly important for all of your lead generation. Your ideal client profile is going to outline where these companies are located. That's going to have a massive impact on how you create these lead generation offers to entice people to essentially trade what's on their business card for what's on the other side of the landing page so they can be nurtured and progress into sales opportunities. So we need to get really specific about where they're located, how big or small their company is, like how big of a company do they need to be to afford your minimums for your typical power and cooling sale? And at what point could they get so large that their needs may be on your current company's capabilities for what you can deliver for power and cooling clients? So where are they located? What's the minimum and maximum number of employees or amount of revenue or something like that that helps you narrow down in a much more targeted way where you want to be generating these leads from? And are there certain business models or there certain industries where you win most often? With that in mind, you should be able to build a target account list, account-based marketing of who these clients are that are most likely to need your power and cooling solution. There could be anywhere from a couple dozen to a couple hundred companies on there. In some really unique cases, if you're a big enough company, there may be a couple thousand potential clients that are on there. For most companies that are critical infrastructure system integrators that sell power and cooling, probably a couple hundred is the right number. If you're a smaller company and you're really focused on huge accounts, it may be a couple dozen. Once you have clarity at the company level, then we need to get clarity at the individual level. Who are the people that you need to build these relationships with, where you're going to educate and build trust with them about anything and everything having to do with data center, power and cooling, critical infrastructure, power and cooling. And the way we identify who these people are is we look at historically who's been in on these client relationships, both early on, in the middle, and post-sale, where you've built these relationships over time. So your account managers, your case studies, again, your CRM will be really helpful with that. Once we've identified who typically are on these decision committees, who these stakeholders are, and we've prioritized the category of the most important and the second most important, a primary and a secondary, maybe there's even a third category of person that pops up that would be like a tertiary buyer persona. Once we do that, we need to do our homework so we understand in each of these segments what they care most about, what is going on in their professional lives that they potentially need help with from a data center system integrator, from a critical infrastructure system integration firm like yours. So we need the consensus on their biggest goals and their biggest challenges. And the way we get that, most companies start by interviewing internal stakeholders within their company. It could be account executives, account managers that have been with your company forever or in this industry forever, or your executive leadership that have been in their roles forever. But I would caution you, this internal input from your own company is only maybe 20, 25% of the puzzle. The other 75, 80% of that customer insight research needs to come directly from their own mouths in their own words. The ideal way to do this is face-to-face or on a Zoom video or something like that. The second best way to do that, if you don't feel comfortable, you don't have access to that, is to identify 5, 10, 20 different people and study the heck out of what you can find about them in their social media and search footprint. In other words, like on their LinkedIn profile, how do they describe themselves? How do they describe what they're trying to accomplish in their job and what they're struggling with the most? When you look at the last 10 or 20 pieces of content that they have interacted with in their activity feed, what do you see? When you look at their skills endorsements, what's the consensus? When you look at what groups they belong to, what newsletters, who they follow, what is the consensus? And hopefully there is a consensus. If there isn't, if you can't find a consensus, you may not have found the buyer persona quite yet. But once we get that, it becomes much easier to create an educational content, an educational event strategy that allows us to spend significant amounts of time with those folks in the awareness and the consideration stages of their buyer's journey long before they're ready for sales contact or vendor contact. Because when we do this right, we earn our way in to get invited in onto their side of a table and their side of the table in a way that's extremely unique to today's marketplace today. So it used to be like 10 years ago, when it comes to like power and cooling, your sales team got to spend about half of the buyer's journey with your prospects and clients. In a self-driven, self-propelled buyer's journey, those days are long gone. We don't get to spend half of the journey anymore. We're lucky if we get to spend 15 or 20% of the buyer's journey. The latest numbers from Gartner shows that 83% of a typical journey is over before sales contact and vendor contact. That means 83% of their mind is already made up before they're willing to meet someone from your sales team. So doing things the way we've always been doing them is a recipe for disaster. We need to figure out a way to get in there early and often in a way that resonates with where they are right now, not where you want them to be in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but where they actually are right now. And where most of these folks are right now is they're more than likely trying to learn about anything and everything that has to do with power and cooling for their critical infrastructure. And the better job that we can do with understanding exactly what those bullet points are, exactly what their goals are, exactly what's driving them nuts, and shows up in a way that adds value. So a person like that, in a company like that, in a certain kind of geographic region, specializing in a certain kind of industry, gets enormous amount of value from you sharing unique insights by seeing the pattern recognition that you and your company have experienced by working with similar stakeholders to these stakeholders for other power and cooling related needs. A lot of people make the mistake in this category of parroting or copying and pasting the vendor marketing collateral that they get from the companies that they represent. The problem with that is not only is there no differentiation because you're all saying the same thing, but it's completely tone deaf to what they actually want to talk about during most of the journey. And the reality is nobody needs you to read the website to them anymore. They just don't. They're doing so much researching, comparing options and evaluating pricing. They're doing so much homework before they get to you that there's a really good chance that some of these prospects and clients will show up knowing your product category better than some of your entry-level sales hires and some of your entry-level account managers. Take that into account when it comes to deciding who you're hiring and the amount that you're spending on upskilling and professional development. Because in order for your power and cooling clients to want to spend time with members of your client-facing teams, they need to see your team members as experts, as teachers, as consultants, as trusted advisors when it comes to anything and everything having to do with power cooling needs around critical infrastructure. And the better job you can be with doing that, the more likely it is that you'll earn your way into as many of those 28 touch points as possible between complete stranger and purchase decision. But if you take the default playbook of parroting just what you hear from vendors and showing up and doing these expos, you're pretty much going to be ignored during the first 83% of the journey. What that means is someone else is advising these prospects and clients on how they navigate these different options that are in front of them, how they compare these different options that are in front of them, the criteria that they use to evaluate your entire category. So if you are serious about being the critical infrastructure system integrator that improves its power and cooling lead generation, it is essential that you get extreme empathy, extreme customer insight about what's going on in their world and show up in a way that adds value throughout the full buyer's journey, not just at the tail end, when they're ready to talk to your sales team about buying your products and services, but when they're really early on. What is the leading indicator that they're going to be coming to that kind of conversation a couple of weeks or a couple of months ahead of time? And the better job you do with showing up early and often in that buyer's journey, the more likely it is that you've solidified your place on their short list. And in many cases, the amount of time and the amount of emotional bonds, educating and trust building that you're doing with those stakeholders will be progressively knocking competitive options off of the short list. So in some cases, you may find by the end of the buyer's journey, by the decision stage, when they're finally ready for a sales conversation, you've won already. And you end up being able to have a much less price-sensitive buyer and protect your margins and sell and close and service on your own terms. But this starts with, in many cases, a company like yours drawing a line in the sand and saying, going forward, it is our goal to be the best educators, the best consultants, the best teachers about anything and everything that it has to do with power and cooling for critical infrastructure in these kinds of companies, in this geographic region, of this size, and these particular stakeholders. These are big cultural changes for a lot of companies, but this is the future going forward of what it looks like to do successful power and cooling lead generation. And that brings us to the final question that I'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button and feel free to leave a comment with a topic, a question, a challenge that you think we ought to address in an upcoming show. So the final question for this week is, how do we grow an industrial power distribution company for data center critical facilities? How does an industrial power distribution company that wants to sell to data center critical facilities grow? That's a fantastic question. So your company is all about power distribution. You're working primarily with data center critical facilities, and you want to be able to grow. So we need to know where you've grown best in the past, because sales, marketing, when it comes to connecting the dots across the full go-to-market team, post-purchase, you have a handoff from an account executive to an account manager or customer success manager who owns that relationship post-purchase and tries to continue to expand and cross-sell and upsell, all customer marketing, all that good stuff with existing clients. Then you also have a product person, a product manager, perhaps a product team, a product leader who decides what's on your roadmap in terms of the features and what you decide to tackle and the kind of unique value that you provide to your clients. Your go-to-market team may also include a channel partnerships person or team that works with integrators, that works with managed service providers, any other third-party solution providers that get involved in critical facilities, power distribution related issues like PDUs or something along those lines. So to grow that kind of business, we need to know where you've been most successful in the past, not just initially, but on an ongoing basis. And the way we're going to figure that out is almost certainly look at your logos and look at your case studies and figure out what they have in common. Where do they tend to be located? How big or how small are they? In other words, can we back into employee headcount, number of employee range for what's the biggest that we can comfortably handle before we get over our heads? And what's the smallest that we can profitably handle where they can afford our minimum levels of engagement? And are there certain industries, are there certain business models where we've been more successful than others when it comes to selling industrial power distribution? For example, maybe you've done really well in healthcare or financial services. You've done really well in K-12 or higher education or government or something like that, or manufacturing or hospitality. Wherever it is, by the nature of either enterprise data centers or operators that have a lot of clients within those particular data centers. Most likely, if you don't have an industry concentration, probably by default, you're working with a lot of data center operators who are in the business of leasing out slices of co-location or huge blocks of wholesale data center capacity, or hyperscale capacity or something like that. Typically, the more turnkey the solutions are, the more likely it is that the operator is getting involved in power distribution kind of decisions, which would lean towards a co-location operator or an edge provider or even a modular provider that's getting involved in providing a lot of managed services for their clients around critical facilities, perhaps even at the intersection of some technology related issues. So to grow that business, we need to know where you've been most successful in the past. At a company level, that helps us to get to your ideal client profile, that helps you to define a target account list of who you want to reach with both ads and outbound. And then individually, who are the stakeholders within those companies where you need to build relationships with, where you need to be educating and building trust with anything and everything having to do with power distribution for their data center critical facilities. This could be facilities executives, this could be technology executives. It depends entirely, usually on the size of the data center operator or the enterprise data center, how specialized these roles are or how generalized these roles are. Naturally, a much smaller company, you'll have one individual wearing a lot of different hats, taking on a lot of different roles. If you're selling to a huge, like publicly traded data center REIT, real estate investment trust that has a global presence, way more specialization of roles, both at the local level, regional level, national and global level. So you'd have different kinds of conversations depending on the unique nature of their particular size. But to grow it, the goal really is to get in as early as possible in their journey, in their research and comparing options and decision-making process, so you have the ability to be seen as the definitive go-to experts on anything and everything having to do with power distribution. What I tend to see a lot of in this particular category is people leaning very heavily on manufacturers' reps. And I see a lot of these manufacturers' reps struggling with a lot of commoditization and being forced to compete on price. And what it largely all comes down to is there may be differentiation on the product and feature set, but there doesn't tend to be a lot of differentiation happening in the early and middle parts of the buyer's journey, which wasn't that big of a deal 10 years ago, but it really is a very big deal now. Because your best buyers of power distribution solutions are doing a ton of research on your category before they get to you. They're going and they're doing dozens of different searches on Google and Siri and Alexa and ChatGPT and Copilot. They're asking their peers, their colleagues, tons of questions on LinkedIn and LinkedIn groups and Slack channels and in ecosystems and in communities. They're watching YouTube videos. They're attending webinars or listening to podcasts. They're reading newsletters. They're being heavily influenced by others that are getting in there early and educating and building trust with them about your category, about power distribution. If you're able to get in early and often, you have a chance to have an extremely powerful impact on how your buyer personas frame this whole category, how they evaluate, how they compare the different options in front of them, when you're able to have many different successful touch points in the typical 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decisions. But again, in this particular category, where I see so much of the action dominated by manufacturers' reps and exhibiting at conferences, a lot of times you're completely conceding the first 83% of the buyer's journey to competitive forces. You're not even bothering to try to show up. And that's a huge problem, because when you're only involved in the last 17% of the journey, when all of the education and trust building has happened, you're marginalized. You're backed into a corner. You're forced to compete on price. And you maybe, best case scenario, have 2 or 3 or 4 touch points of those 28. Your goal should be to get in as early as possible so that your team, your client-facing team members, are seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with power distribution. Am I saying that you should go in and immediately come up with a search, find and replace, or a better synonym for your job titles that show up on your LinkedIn profile and your email signature and business card? Perhaps, but it's usually a much bigger issue than that. It involves hiring certain kinds of talent so that they're truly seen as consultants among your clients. It involves upskilling existing and cross-training existing talent. It involves having a strong, self-driven educational content strategy. It involves having a one-to-many motion with both in-person events and online virtual events. I just came across a couple of weeks ago a company that is in this category that has done phenomenal with lunch and learn events in their local regions where they have local presence, because they're bringing people into a classroom environment. And over the course of 45 or 60 minutes, they're doing a ton of professional development and cross training for their prospects and clients. They're answering questions, they're building rapport with them, and they're getting to know them on a deep emotional level. If you can't do that in person, the next best thing is this: virtual live streams, webinars, and getting really, really dialed into what they care most about. That's the tricky part with all of this, because by definition, the manufacturer's rep-centric part of this industry just wants to demo its products all day long. And that certainly has a place when they're ready for it. But early on, we need to show up in a way that helps those people, those folks, those professionals in those roles, in facility management roles, sometimes in technology roles, where there's still a chance to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all the other options in front of them. And it starts by understanding exactly what's going on up here, what's driving them nuts, and figuring out a way that you can add value to their professional lives. That's not only a differentiator, but it completely flips the context to where they actually want to spend time with members of your team, as opposed to your team spending all of their energy begging for attention. If you're spending all of your time and energy begging for attention, you're living in an era that's 10 years past already. We need to create an environment so that your prospects and clients actually want to spend time with members of your client-facing team, because they're learning so much from those interactions. It feels a lot more like they're talking to a Big Four consultant rather than an account executive or a sales development rep. It means these conversations are so valuable that it feels like they're talking to someone from like KPMG or Deloitte or PwC or EY or something like that. So when it comes to these changes within your company, these are big cultural issues. It impacts how you hire people. It impacts how you onboard them. It impacts how you train them. It impacts how you set up teams. And most of all, dramatically impacts how you make your investments around lead generation, lead nurturing, educating, and trust building, and will for sure change the ratio at which you make strategic investments in paid media and paid events, earned media and earned events, as well as owned media. And kind of the punchline with all of this is most companies are starving their owned media investments because they're severely overinvesting in paid and earned, which has a more blurry line between the two than there's ever had in the past. That's a whole separate issue. But they're just not investing nearly enough resources in owned media and owned events, where you have 100% attention of the people that you want to build these relationships with, rather than sharing it with a couple hundred other companies in an environment that's a lot more about partying a lot of times and networking with each other for potentially passing leads to their peers, as opposed to educating and building trust with their target buyer personas. And when you get really dialed into who your best clients are and what they care most about, it really changes how you want to make all of these investments going forward. One, to align with the way that they're actually buying as opposed to the way you think you're buying, but second, in a way that changes the context so that your company is seen as the be-all end-all expert when it comes to anything and everything having to do with growing an industrial power distribution company for data center critical facilities. So that's the final question that we're going to have time for this week. In this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales Marketing Q&A show, I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We are all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry to make sure that you stay up to date on new educational resources and podcasts and webinars, learning opportunities just like this. Make sure you subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. On our website at www.dcsmi.com. Until next time, I wish you great success in growing your influence, your team's influence, and your company's influence in the data center and digital infrastructure industry. Take care now and have a great week.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.